In the world of politics, there are always people who stand out. Some rise because they have a vision, others because they know how to speak their minds. This story is about two such women who became the talk of the town, not just for their ideas but also for the drama that unfolded between them. Let's start with Jasmine Crockett. She was someone you couldn't ignore if you tried. With her bold speeches and no-nonsense attitude, she quickly made a name for herself as a fighter for the underdog. Whether it was talking about education, healthcare, or workers' rights, Jasmine had this way of making people feel like she truly understood their struggles. Her energy was contagious and her supporters loved her for it. But her critics? Well, they thought she was too aggressive, too loud, and maybe even a bit reckless at times. On the other side of the aisle was Karoline Leavitt. If Jasmine was fire, Karoline was calm water. She had this quiet confidence about her that drew people in. She wasn't one to shout from rooftops. Instead, she let her words do the work. People admired her poise and the way she could break down complex issues into simple terms anyone could understand. To her fans, she was the voice of reason. To her opponents, though, she sometimes came across as cold or disconnected from everyday problems. Now here's where things get interesting. These two women were poles apart when it came to their beliefs. Jasmine leaned left, fighting for progressive policies, while Karoline stayed firmly on the right, advocating for traditional values. They lived in different worlds, so to speak, but fate had other plans. It all started during a town hall meeting. You know, those events where politicians sit together and answer questions from regular folks? That day, Jasmine and Karoline ended up sharing the stage. At first glance, everything seemed normal. They shook hands, exchanged polite smiles, and took their seats. But as the discussion went on, it became clear that sparks were flying. Quietly, at least, one moment stood out more than the rest. A man in the audience asked about taxes, and both women jumped in with their answers. Jasmine argued passionately that tax cuts should benefit working families, not big corporations. She spoke directly to the crowd, pointing out how hardworking people were struggling to make ends meet. Karoline, however, countered by saying that cutting corporate taxes actually helped create jobs, which ultimately benefited everyone. She kept her tone steady, almost like she was teaching a lesson rather than debating. The audience clapped after each response, torn between the two perspectives. What most people didn't notice, though, was the subtle tension building between Jasmine and Karoline. Every time one spoke, the other would nod politely, but their eyes told a different story. There was respect, sure, but also a hint of rivalry. It was as if they were silently sizing each other up, wondering who would come out on top. After the event, reporters swarmed them for sound bites. Jasmine gave sharp, fiery quotes, while Karoline offered measured, thoughtful responses. Neither mentioned the other directly, but it was obvious they were aware of the growing buzz around their clash of ideologies. Social media lit up with comparisons. Who won the debate? Which one do you trust more? The hashtags started pouring in, and soon enough the whole country was paying attention. Neither Jasmine nor Karoline realized it then, but this was just the beginning. Their paths were now intertwined whether they liked it or not. Little did they know their next encounter would take things to a whole new level, and neither woman would be prepared for what was coming. What happened next? Well, that's a story for another part, but let's just say Jasmine Crockett wasn't ready for the storm that was brewing, and Karoline Leavitt was about to show everyone exactly why she shouldn't be underestimated. The tension between the two women didn't end with that town hall meeting. In fact, it was just getting started. A few weeks later, Jasmine decided to take things up a notch. She had been thinking about Karoline's comments on taxes and corporate policies, replaying them in her mind over and over again. To her, it felt like Karoline wasn't being honest about whose side she was really on. So Jasmine did what she always did when something bothered her. She spoke up, and this time, she chose social media as her platform. It all began with a tweet. Jasmine posted a short but pointed message calling out Karoline's stance on education reform. How can someone claim to care about kids, Jasmine wrote, when their policies only benefit big businesses? This isn't leadership. It's lip service. Her words spread quickly, especially since she tagged Karoline directly. Within minutes, replies flooded in. Some people agreed with Jasmine, praising her for standing up for what they believed was right. Others defended Karoline, accusing Jasmine of twisting facts to suit her narrative. But Jasmine didn't stop there. Over the next few hours, she fired off several more tweets, each one sharper than the last. She highlighted statistics showing how certain policies favored corporations over public schools. She shared stories from teachers and parents who said they were struggling under systems that seemed designed to fail them. By the time she finished, her thread had thousands of likes, retweets, and comments. It was clear she had struck a nerve. At first, Karoline stayed silent. Her team probably advised her to ignore the attacks, figuring that responding might only fan the flames. But silence has a funny way of speaking louder than words. To Jasmine's supporters, Karoline's lack of response looked like an admission of guilt. To Karoline's base, it seemed like she was taking the high road. Either way, the internet wasn't going to let this go quietly. That's when things got wild. Supporters of both sides jumped into the fray, turning what started as a critique into a full-blown online feud. Memes popped up left and right. Some showed Jasmine as a superhero fighting for justice, while others depicted Karoline as a calm and collected leader surrounded by chaos. Hashtags like "Sorry Truth Over Noise" and "SAR Facts Matter" trended alongside "In Stand with Jasmine" and "Respect for Karoline." People debated endlessly in comment sections, forums, and even text messages. It felt like the entire country had picked a side. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Karoline was watching everything unfold. At first, she tried to brush it off, focusing on her upcoming campaign events and speeches. But the pressure kept mounting. Her advisors urged her to address the situation before it spiraled further out of control. They reminded her that ignoring the issue wouldn't make it disappear. It would only give Jasmine more ammunition. Finally, after days of deliberation, Karoline made her move. She didn't do it on social media, though. Instead, she waited for her moment during a live interview on a popular news network. The host, knowing the buzz around the feud, wasted no time bringing up Jasmine's criticisms. "What's your response to these accusations?" the host asked, leaning forward as if expecting fireworks. Karoline smiled, a calm, confident smile that immediately caught everyone's attention. Then, without missing a beat, she began dismantling Jasmine's arguments one by one. She cited studies, quoted experts, and even shared personal stories from her own life to illustrate her points. Her tone was steady, almost conversational, but her words carried weight. She explained why she believed her approach to education reform was practical and sustainable, addressing concerns about funding and teacher support along the way. Just when viewers thought the segment was wrapping up, Karoline delivered the line that everyone would be talking about for weeks. Looking straight into the camera, she said, "If my opponent wants to play games with sound bites and Twitter spats, I'll gladly meet her there. But let's not confuse noise with substance." The room fell silent for a split second before erupting into applause. Viewers at home couldn't get enough of it. Clips of the interview went viral within minutes, racking up millions of views. Supporters praised Karoline for handling herself with grace and intelligence, while critics argued she hadn't fully addressed some of Jasmine's key points. Either way, it was undeniable. Karoline had thrown down the gauntlet, and now all eyes were on Jasmine to see how she'd respond. For Jasmine, the impact hit hard. She had expected pushback, sure, but nothing quite like this. Friends close to her said she felt blindsided, like she'd underestimated Karoline's ability to turn the tables so effectively. For someone used to dominating conversations, this was unfamiliar territory. Still, Jasmine wasn't one to back down easily. As soon as she saw the interview, she knew she had to act, and fast. She called an emergency meeting with her team late that night. Sitting around a table littered with coffee cups and notebooks, they brainstormed strategies for hitting back. Some suggested doubling down on social media, posting even more content to counter Karoline's claims. Others recommended taking a step back, letting the dust settle before making another move. After hours of debate, they settled on a plan. Jasmine would hold a press conference. Not just any press conference, though. This one would be bold, unapologetic, and impossible. to ignore. As the days passed, anticipation built. Everyone wondered what Jasmine would say, how she'd frame her rebuttal, and whether she could reclaim the momentum she'd lost. Reporters camped outside her office, eager for a scoop. Fans posted encouraging messages online, urging her to stay strong. Critics, meanwhile, speculated about whether she'd stumble under the pressure. When the day finally arrived, Jasmine walked into the room with purpose. Dressed in a sharp suit and wearing her signature confident expression, she stood behind a podium adorned with her campaign logo. Cameras flashed as she adjusted the microphone, pausing briefly to gather her thoughts. Then, with a deep breath, she began. Her opening remarks were fiery, as expected. She accused Karoline of hiding behind polished talking points rather than engaging in meaningful dialogue. "You can dress up misinformation all you want," Jasmine declared, her voice rising with emotion. "But facts are stubborn things, and the truth is on our side." From there, she unveiled a detailed policy proposal aimed directly at countering Karoline's platform. Page after page, she laid out her vision for education reform, complete with charts, graphs, and testimonials from experts. It was clear she had put in the work, and many in the audience nodded in approval. By the time she finished, the room was buzzing with energy. But the real question remained: had Jasmine done enough to regain control of the narrative? Or had Karoline's earlier comments already shifted the conversation in her favor? Only time would tell. One thing was certain, though. The battle between these two formidable women was far from over. The press conference was over, but the ripple effects of Jasmine's fiery rebuttal were just beginning to take shape. People couldn't stop talking about it. Social media timelines were flooded with reactions, some praising her boldness, others questioning whether she had gone too far. Supporters hailed her as a fighter who refused to back down, while critics argued that her approach was more about theatrics than substance. Meanwhile, Karoline's camp watched closely, analyzing every word Jasmine had said and strategizing their next move. Karoline herself remained calm, almost eerily so. She didn't rush to respond immediately. Instead, she took her time, letting Jasmine's words hang in the air for a bit longer. Her team knew that patience could be a powerful weapon in situations like this. By staying quiet, Karoline allowed the public to digest everything without feeling overwhelmed by another wave of arguments right away. But behind closed doors, she was anything but idle. During a private meeting with her advisors, Karoline listened intently as they broke down Jasmine's latest statements. They highlighted areas where they believed she had overstated her case or cherry-picked data to fit her narrative. One advisor even joked, "She sure knows how to put on a show." Karoline chuckled at the comment, but quickly shifted back to business. She wanted to make sure her response wouldn't just counter Jasmine. It needed to elevate the conversation. A few days later, Karoline made her next move. It came during an appearance on a popular morning talk show, the kind of program millions of people tuned into while sipping their coffee. The host greeted her warmly, complimenting her composure throughout the ongoing feud. Then, inevitably, the topic turned to Jasmine. "So, what do you have to say about her recent press conference?" the host asked, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. Karoline leaned back slightly in her chair, exuding the same calm confidence she'd shown in her earlier interview. She smiled briefly before diving into her response. "Look," she began, her tone measured but firm. "I respect anyone who's passionate about making a difference. But passion alone isn't enough. You need solutions that actually work, not just sound good in headlines." From there, she went point by point, addressing the policy proposal Jasmine had unveiled. She acknowledged some valid concerns raised in the document, but also pointed out flaws in its execution. For example, one section of Jasmine's plan called for significantly increased funding for public schools, which Karoline agreed was important. However, she argued that simply throwing money at the problem wasn't the answer. Instead, she suggested redirecting resources toward teacher training programs and modernizing outdated curriculums. Her explanations were clear and concise, avoiding jargon that might alienate viewers. She spoke directly to the camera, connecting with everyday people who cared deeply about these issues but didn't always understand the finer details. At one point, she shared a personal story about visiting a rural school district where students lacked basic supplies like textbooks and reliable internet access. "These kids deserve better," she said, her voice softening. "But we can't fix their problems overnight. We need practical steps, not empty promises." Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the clapback. Just when it seemed like Karoline was wrapping up her remarks, she added a final thought that left jaws dropping. "My opponent has accused me of hiding behind talking points, but I think the real issue here is distraction. When you don't have answers, you create noise. And let's be honest, noise gets attention, but it doesn't solve problems." The studio audience erupted in applause, clearly impressed by her ability to stay composed under pressure. Viewers at home weren't far behind. Within minutes, clips of the segment started circulating online, racking up millions of views. Supporters praised Karoline for her poise and intelligence, saying she had once again proven why she was a force to be reckoned with. Critics, however, accused her of dodging certain aspects of Jasmine's argument altogether. Either way, the buzz was undeniable. For Jasmine, watching the interview was both infuriating and humbling. On one hand, she felt like Karoline had misrepresented parts of her proposal. On the other, she couldn't deny that her rival had delivered a masterclass in messaging. Friends close to Jasmine said she spent hours replaying the segment, dissecting every word Karoline had said. Some advised her to strike back immediately, while others suggested taking a step back to regroup. Ultimately, Jasmine decided to do neither, at least not yet. Instead, she focused on hitting the ground running. Over the next few weeks, she crisscrossed the state, holding town halls and meeting with voters face-to-face. These events gave her a chance to explain her policies in her own words, free from the constraints of sound bites or carefully edited interviews. She listened to people's concerns, answered their questions, and reminded them why she was fighting so hard for change. It was grassroots campaigning at its finest, and it resonated with many who felt disconnected from traditional politics. Meanwhile, Karoline continued her own outreach efforts, though her style was markedly different. While Jasmine thrived on energy and emotion, Karoline excelled at building trust through consistency. She visited local businesses, attended community events, and wrote op-eds outlining her vision for the future. Her message was simple. Progress required patience, collaboration, and a willingness to find common ground, even with those you disagreed with. As the weeks turned into months, something interesting happened. Public opinion began to shift. Initially, many people had been drawn to the drama of the feud, eagerly picking sides based on whose rhetoric appealed to them more. But as time went on, fatigue set in. Voters grew tired of the constant bickering and started asking themselves a crucial question. What did any of this have to do with solving real-world problems? This shift didn't go unnoticed by either woman. Both Jasmine and Karoline realized that continuing down the same path risked alienating the very people they were trying to win over. Still, neither was ready to back down completely. They had invested too much time and energy into this battle to walk away without a resolution. But what form that resolution would take, and who would emerge victorious, remained to be seen. In the end, the feud between Jasmine and Karoline became more than just a clash of ideologies. It was a lesson in leadership, communication, and the delicate balance between standing your ground and knowing when to extend an olive branch. Neither woman realized it at the time, but their rivalry was about to take a surprising turn. One that would challenge everything they thought they knew about each other and themselves. The tension between the two women had reached a boiling point. For weeks, they had been trading barbs on social media, in interviews, and through policy announcements. The public was divided. Some admired Jasmine's fiery determination, while others respected Karoline's calm and calculated approach. But as the days dragged on, something unexpected began to happen. People started losing interest. Sure, the drama had been entertaining at first. Memes were shared, hashtags trended, and debates raged online. But after a while, the constant back and forth started feeling like background noise. Voters who initially tuned in for the spectacle now found themselves asking, What's the point of all this? They wanted solutions, not endless arguments. And both Jasmine and Karoline could sense the shift. Jasmine, in particular, felt it acutely. Her team brought her poll numbers during one of their strategy meetings, and the results weren't encouraging. While her base remained fiercely loyal, undecided voters were drifting away. Some said her tone came across as too confrontational. Others felt she was more focused on attacking Karoline than addressing their concerns. It was a wake-up call. Jasmine knew she couldn't afford to lose momentum, not when so much was at stake. Her advisors urged her to pivot. "We need to remind people why they believed in you in the first place," one of them said. "You're not just fighting against someone, you're fighting for something." That resonated with Jasmine. She realized that while standing her ground was important, there was a difference between being strong and coming off as stubborn. She decided it was time to change tactics. A few days later, Jasmine called a press conference. This time, though, it wasn't about slamming Karoline or defending herself. Instead, she used the platform to focus squarely on the issues that mattered most to her supporters. She talked passionately about education reform, healthcare access, and economic inequality. She shared stories from people she'd met during her travels, teachers working multiple jobs to make ends meet, families struggling to pay medical bills, small business owners trying to keep their dreams alive despite rising costs. But what really stood out was her tone. Gone was the sharp edge that had defined her earlier responses. In its place was a sincerity that made listeners lean in. She admitted that she hadn't always gotten things right, but emphasized that her heart was in the right place. "I'm not perfect," she said, pausing for effect, "but I'm here because I believe we can do better, for everyone." The speech struck a chord. People who had written her off as overly aggressive suddenly saw a different side of her. Even some of Karoline's supporters grudgingly admitted that Jasmine had made a compelling case. For the first time in weeks, the conversation shifted away from petty squabbles and toward actual solutions. Karoline, meanwhile, watched the press conference closely. She couldn't deny that Jasmine had delivered a solid performance, one that forced her to rethink her own strategy. Up until now, she had relied heavily on staying above the fray, letting her policies speak for themselves. But as Jasmine regained ground, Karoline realized she needed to adapt if she wanted to maintain her edge. Her moment came during a community event in a small town. The gathering was low-key, attended mostly by local residents looking for answers rather than headlines. Karoline took the stage and spoke candidly about the challenges facing the area: job losses, crumbling infrastructure, and limited access to quality education. She didn't shy away from acknowledging the frustrations people felt, nor did she sugarcoat the difficulties ahead. But instead of dwelling on problems, she offered hope. "We can't solve everything overnight," she said, her voice steady but warm. "But we can start by listening to each other, to experts, and to new ideas. Progress doesn't happen when we're shouting past one another. It happens when we work together." Then, in a surprising twist, she extended an olive branch. Turning to the crowd, she said, "There's someone else out there who cares deeply about these issues too. Maybe we don't agree on every detail, but I think we can find common ground. So, I'd like to invite her to join me in a bipartisan discussion about education reform. Let's put aside the noise and focus on what really matters: the future of our kids." The room erupted in applause. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, knowing it could be a game changer. Within hours, news of Karoline's invitation spread like wildfire. Social media lit up with reactions ranging from cautious optimism to outright skepticism. Could these two women really set aside their differences and work together? Or was this just another PR stunt? For Jasmine, the invitation caught her off guard. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as insincere, a way for Karoline to look cooperative without actually committing to anything. But deep down, she knew ignoring it outright would reflect poorly on her. After consulting with her team, she agreed to participate, but only if the discussion happened in front of an audience. Transparency, she argued, was key. The joint appearance was scheduled for the following week, and anticipation ran high. Supporters of both women debated what might happen. Would sparks fly? Would they find common ground? Or would it devolve into another round of bickering? Whatever the outcome, one thing was clear. This was more than just a meeting. It was a test of leadership. On the day of the event, the atmosphere was electric. Hundreds of people packed into the auditorium, eager to see how things would unfold. Cameras rolled as Jasmine and Karoline took their seats on stage, flanked by moderators tasked with keeping the conversation productive. For the first time in months, the focus wasn't on who could land the best zinger. It was on finding real solutions. Both women started cautiously, sticking to their prepared remarks and avoiding direct confrontation. But as the discussion went on, something remarkable happened. They began engaging with each other genuinely. They acknowledged areas where they disagreed, but also highlighted points of agreement. At one point, Jasmine even nodded approvingly when Karoline suggested increasing funding for teacher training programs, a key part of her own proposal. By the end of the session, the mood had shifted entirely. Applause filled the room as the moderators thanked both participants for their willingness to engage constructively. Outside, reporters clamored for sound bites, but neither woman gave in to the temptation to boast. Instead, they reiterated their commitment to working toward meaningful change, even if they approached it from different angles. For many observers, the event marked a turning point. It showed that disagreement didn't have to mean hostility, that two people with vastly different views could still come together for the greater good. Of course, old habits die hard, and no one expected the rivalry to disappear completely. But for the first time in a long time, there was a sense of possibility, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, politics didn't have to be a zero-sum game. As Jasmine and Karoline left the stage that evening, they exchanged a brief smile, a small gesture that spoke volumes. Neither woman walked away convinced the other was right, but both walked away with a newfound respect for what the other brought to the table. And sometimes that's enough to make all the difference. The joint appearance had gone better than anyone expected, including Jasmine and Karoline themselves. For weeks, people couldn't stop talking about it. Social media was flooded with clips of the event, moments where both women nodded in agreement, exchanged respectful smiles, or even laughed at a shared joke. It was refreshing to see two strong personalities set aside their differences, even if just for a little while. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. Viewers praised them not for changing their beliefs, but for showing that differing opinions could coexist without turning into a shouting match. But as the dust settled, reality began to creep back in. Neither Jasmine nor Karoline was naive enough to think one conversation would magically erase all the tension between them. They were still on opposite sides of the political spectrum, and their goals remained fundamentally different. What had changed, however, was how they chose to engage with each other moving forward. Both women realized that continuing to tear each other down wasn't helping anyone. It was only making voters more cynical about the entire process. Jasmine returned to her campaign trail with renewed energy. She decided to shift her focus away from attacking Karoline and instead doubled down on connecting with everyday people. Her team organized town halls in smaller communities, places often overlooked by politicians. These events weren't flashy or designed to grab headlines. They were raw and unfiltered. People came with real questions, concerns, and frustrations, and Jasmine listened intently. She didn't shy away from tough topics like rising living costs, lack of affordable housing, or inadequate healthcare access. Instead, she leaned into them, explaining how her policies aimed to tackle these issues head-on. Her authenticity resonated deeply with attendees. One woman stood up during a Q&A session and said, "I've heard you talk before, but this is the first time I feel like you're really hearing us." That comment stuck with Jasmine long after the event ended. It reminded her why she got into politics in the first place, not to win arguments but to make life better for people who felt forgotten. Karoline, too, adjusted her approach. Inspired by the success of the bipartisan discussion, she started hosting similar forums in her own district. Unlike her usual polished appearances, these gatherings were intimate and informal. She sat at round tables with community members, sipping coffee and jotting down notes as they spoke. Some voiced support for her ideas, while others challenged her policies outright. But rather than brushing off criticism, Karoline embraced it. She saw value in understanding perspectives different from her own. It helped her refine her proposals and address blind spots she might have missed. One particularly memorable moment happened during a forum in a rural area. A farmer stood up and expressed frustration over new regulations he believed were hurting his business. Karoline listened patiently, then asked thoughtful follow-up questions to understand his situation better. By the end of the exchange, she hadn't promised to scrap the regulations entirely, but she did commit to working with local leaders to find ways to ease the burden on small businesses. The farmer left the room nodding, saying, "At least someone's listening." As both women crisscrossed the state, their paths occasionally crossed again. Sometimes it was at debates, other times at charity events or fundraisers. Each encounter was markedly different from their earlier interactions. There was still an underlying competitiveness, sure, but it was tempered by mutual respect. They no longer felt the need to constantly prove who was smarter or more capable. Instead, they focused on showcasing their unique strengths and visions for the future. This newfound dynamic didn't go unnoticed by the public. Voters appreciated seeing less hostility and more collaboration. Opinion pieces began popping up in newspapers, praising Jasmine and Karoline for setting an example of civility in an increasingly divisive world. Teachers used their story in classrooms to teach students about respectful disagreement. Even late-night comedians joked about how rare it was to see two politicians act like adults instead of adversaries. Still, challenges persisted. Not everyone was happy about the truce. Hardcore supporters on both sides felt betrayed, accusing their favorite candidate of going soft. Online trolls tried to reignite old feuds by digging up past comments or exaggerating minor disagreements. But Jasmine and Karoline refused to take the bait. They knew reopening old wounds wouldn't serve anyone, not themselves, not their campaigns, and certainly not the people counting on them to lead. Their persistence paid off. Poll numbers showed a noticeable uptick in favorability ratings for both women. Undecided voters, once turned off by the constant bickering, now found themselves genuinely interested in learning more about their platforms. Media coverage shifted from sensationalism to substance, focusing on policy details rather than personal attacks. It was clear that the tone of the race had fundamentally changed, for the better. Behind the scenes, Jasmine and Karoline occasionally communicated directly. At first, it was purely professional, emails arranging logistics for upcoming events or clarifying statements made in interviews. Over time, though, their exchanges became friendlier. They shared lighthearted remarks about long days on the campaign trail or commiserated over the challenges of balancing work and family life. Neither would call it a friendship. It was still too early for that. But there was a growing sense of camaraderie. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of campaigning, Jasmine sent Karoline a text message. "You know, we're probably the only two people who truly understand what this feels like." Karoline replied almost immediately, "Agreed. Doesn't mean I'm going to let you win, though." Jasmine chuckled, typing back, "Wouldn't expect anything less." These small moments of connection mattered more than either woman cared to admit. Politics could be lonely, especially when you were constantly under scrutiny. Having someone, even someone on the opposing side, who understood the pressures made the journey feel slightly less isolating. As Election Day approached, the rivalry intensified again. But this time, it was different. Both candidates gave it their all, presenting their cases passionately and persuasively. Campaign ads highlighted their achievements, volunteers knocked on doors tirelessly, and rallies drew massive crowds. Yet through it all, the tone remained respectful. When asked about each other in interviews, neither took cheap shots. Instead, they acknowledged the hard work and dedication the other brought to the table. In the final days leading up to the vote, something remarkable happened. During a televised debate, the last one before Election Day, moderators posed a question neither woman anticipated. "If your opponent wins, what will you say to them afterward?" Jasmine went first. Pausing for a moment, she said, "I'll congratulate them and offer my support wherever I can." This isn't about me. It's about serving the people who trusted us to lead. When it was Karoline's turn, she echoed the sentiment. I'll do the same, she said with a smile. We may disagree on many things, but we both want what's best for our communities. That's something worth respecting. The audience erupted in applause, moved by the sincerity of their words. It was a powerful reminder that leadership wasn't just about winning. It was about integrity, humility, and putting the needs of others above personal ambition. Election night arrived, bringing with it a mix of excitement and anxiety. Supporters gathered at campaign headquarters watching results roll in. Analysts debated every twist and turn, speculating about which candidate had the edge. But regardless of who ultimately won, one thing was certain. Jasmine and Karoline had already achieved something extraordinary. Through their actions, they had shown that even in the heat of competition, kindness and respect could prevail. And perhaps that was the most important victory of all. Election night came and went, leaving behind a whirlwind of emotions. When the final votes were counted, the results showed a closer race than anyone had predicted. While one candidate emerged victorious, the real winner wasn't just an individual. It was the spirit of collaboration and respect that had defined the campaign's later stages. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had taught both women and everyone watching some valuable lessons about leadership, resilience, and humanity. For Jasmine, the outcome was bittersweet. She had poured her heart and soul into the race, traveling thousands of miles, meeting countless people and fighting tirelessly for the causes she believed in. Though she didn't win, she refused to see herself as a failure. On election night, standing in front of her supporters with tears glistening in her eyes, she delivered a speech that resonated deeply with everyone present. I may not have won this battle, she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. But we've already won something far greater. We proved that passion and purpose can inspire change, even when the odds are stacked against you. And I want to thank each and every one of you for believing in me, for standing by my side, and for reminding me why this fight matters. She paused, scanning the room filled with faces young and old, hopeful and determined. To my opponent, she continued, turning toward the cameras broadcasting live across the state, I offer my congratulations. You ran a good race, and I know you'll serve our communities with integrity. But let me make one thing clear. This isn't the end of my story. I'm not done fighting for the values we hold dear, for fairness, opportunity, and justice. So don't count me out yet. Her words earned thunderous applause, not just from her own supporters, but from neutral observers who admired her grit. Even some of Karoline's backers couldn't help but feel a pang of respect for her unwavering determination. Jasmine walked off the stage that night knowing she had left everything on the field, and that sometimes losing gracefully is its own kind of victory. Karoline, on the other hand, stood at the podium surrounded by cheering crowds, balloons falling around her. As confetti rained down, it was a moment she had dreamed of for years. Yet instead of basking solely in her triumph, she chose to acknowledge the significance of the journey they'd all been through together. This victory doesn't belong to me alone, she said, gripping the sides of the podium tightly. It belongs to everyone who believes in working together even when it's hard. To everyone who reminded us that disagreement doesn't have to mean division. And yes, to my opponent, whose courage and conviction pushed me to be better. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Jasmine fought fiercely for what she believes in, and I admire that. Our differences challenged me to think harder, listen more closely, and dig deeper into my own convictions. If there's one thing I hope people take away from this campaign, it's that progress happens when we embrace those differences, not run from them. The crowd erupted again, moved by her humility and acknowledgement of the role Jasmine had played in shaping the tone of the race. For Karoline, this moment wasn't just about celebrating her win. It was about recognizing the shared responsibility they all carried moving forward. In the weeks following the election, both women returned to their respective corners of public life. But their paths continued to intersect in unexpected ways. Jasmine threw herself back into grassroots activism, organizing workshops and town halls to keep the momentum going. She focused on empowering marginalized voices, ensuring that the issues she cared about stayed at the forefront of public discourse. Her fiery energy remained undiminished, though she now tempered it with the wisdom she'd gained during the campaign. Karoline, stepping into her new role, faced the daunting task of living up to the promises she'd made on the trail. Governing was different from campaigning. It required compromise, patience, and a willingness to admit when things weren't working. True to her word, she reached out to Jasmine multiple times, seeking input on key initiatives like education, reform, and workforce development. Their conversations weren't always smooth sailing, but they were productive. Both women understood that collaboration, however imperfect, was better than gridlock. Their relationship evolved over time, shifting from cautious respect to genuine admiration. They occasionally appeared together at non-partisan events, discussing topics like civic engagement and the importance of bipartisanship. These appearances drew large audiences eager to see two former rivals working side by side. Critics still questioned their motives, accusing them of grandstanding or using optics to polish their images. But most people saw something else, a reminder that politics didn't have to be a zero-sum game. One particularly memorable moment occurred during a charity gala honoring community leaders. As fate would have it, Jasmine and Karoline ended up seated next to each other at the head table. Throughout the evening, they exchanged playful banter, laughing over inside jokes only they understood. When it came time for speeches, the MC joked about inviting both women to share the stage since they seemed inseparable lately. To everyone's surprise, they agreed. Standing shoulder to shoulder under the spotlight, Jasmine grabbed the microphone. "First, let me start by saying this feels surreal," she quipped, earning laughter from the audience. "A year ago, if someone told me I'd be sharing a stage with her without throwing shade, I'd have called them crazy." More laughs followed, but then her tone grew serious. "What I've learned from this experience is simple. None of us has all the answers. But if we're willing to listen, to challenge each other respectfully, and to find common ground where we can, we might actually get somewhere." Karoline took the mic next, nodding in agreement. "I couldn't have said it better myself," she admitted with a smile. "This past year has shown me that competition doesn't have to come at the expense of civility. Disagreement doesn't have to breed animosity. And leadership isn't about being right all the time. It's about doing what's right even when it's hard." As they shook hands and posed for photos afterward, the audience erupted in applause. Not because they agreed with everything either woman stood for, but because they recognized the effort it took to rise above pettiness and focus on the bigger picture. In a world increasingly divided by anger and distrust, Jasmine and Karoline offered a glimmer of hope. Looking back, neither woman regretted the twists and turns their journey had taken. The feud, the fiery exchanges, the moments of vulnerability, they had all contributed to their growth both personally and professionally. Jasmine learned that passion needed direction. Karoline discovered that calmness could coexist with boldness. Together they demonstrated that true strength lies not in tearing others down but in lifting everyone up. Years later, when asked about their rivalry turned respect, both women smiled knowingly. "It wasn't easy," Jasmine admitted during an interview, "but nothing worth doing ever is." Karoline echoed the sentiment. "We didn't always agree, but we always tried to understand." And maybe that's the lesson here. That understanding is the first step toward progress. So while their names will forever be linked in history books and headlines, their legacy goes beyond any single race or policy debate. Jasmine Crockett and Karoline Leavitt showed the world that even in the heat of competition, kindness, empathy, and mutual respect can shine through. And in doing so, they reminded us all what it truly means to lead, not just with words, but with actions.